Windsor has been building cars for longer than most countries have had modern governments. The city on the south shore of the Detroit River has been part of North America's automotive supply chain since before the Second World War. In 2025, it absorbed what Unifor National President Lana Payne called the worst year Canadian auto workers had experienced in a generation. Tariffs from the South, EV program cancellations from the same companies that Windsor had spent years tooling up to support, and a Stellantis decision that moved 3,000 Brampton jobs to Illinois in what the company described as a production optimization. Windsor is still building cars, but the question of whether it will be doing so in 15 years is no longer rhetorical. To understand what happened to Windsor, you need to understand the particular vulnerability of the tool and die sector, the companies that make the specialized molds, dies, and precision components that automotive assembly depends on. These are not commodity suppliers. A tool and die shop that spends 18 months building custom-forming equipment for a specific EV battery tray cannot pivot to a different program in a quarter. The investment is specific to the order. When the order disappears, the equipment has no other customer. Windsor's tool and die sector employs thousands of skilled tradespeople in facilities along the EC Row Expressway Industrial Corridor, east of the Ambassador Bridge. These are typically Tier 2 or Tier 3 suppliers selling to assemblers like Magna or Martin Rea, who supply Stellantis, GM, and Ford. When Trump signed the Section 232 automotive tariff in March 2025, cost pressure moved instantly down the chain. Tier 1 assemblers compressed their pricing to Canadian suppliers, who absorbed the compression as a margin reduction because the alternative was losing the contract entirely. At the same time, General Motors was executing a broader retreat from the EV programs it had committed to through 2022 and 2023. Detroit's three major automakers collectively wrote off $53 billion in EV strategy revisions. For Windsor's tool and die sector, that retreat was not an accounting entry. Narmco Group, a Windsor area supplier, took direct order losses when GM canceled specific EV projects the company had built tooling and capacity to support. The Bank of Canada's April 2026 Monetary Policy Report documented the scale of the shift. The average U.S. tariff on Canadian goods had risen from 0.1% to 5.8% over 12 months. On a supply chain where components cross the border multiple times before reaching final assembly, that figure compounds. The margin that Windsor shops had built their business models around no longer existed in the same form. And unlike a price increase that a retailer can pass to a consumer, a Tier 2 automotive supplier has no one to pass the compression to. It absorbs it until it cannot. Here is where it gets really interesting. The October 2025 Stellantis decision to move Jeep Compass production from the Brampton assembly plant to Belvidere, Illinois, did not happen in isolation. It happened in an environment where the Trump administration had made clear, through tariff policy and through public statements, that domestic U.S. production would be rewarded and cross-border production would face cost penalties. Brian Kingston, president of the Canadian Vehicle Manufacturers Association, said publicly that the Brampton decision demonstrated the risk of allowing the trade policy environment to remain unresolved. What Kingston was describing carefully was straightforward. When a global automaker has a production decision pending and one location faces a 25% tariff environment, while the other does not, the calculation is not complicated. When Carney's government served Stellantis with a notice of default on its funding agreements, the move signaled something larger than a legal dispute. Stellantis had accepted public money with production commitments attached. Moving to Illinois may have constituted a breach. That dispute remains unresolved as of May 2026. But its existence marks the end of an era, the assumption that Canadian governments could anchor automotive investment through funding agreements and trust the cross-border relationship to hold that assumption no longer holds. The workers who paid the most immediate price are the 3,000 Brampton employees whose production certainty evaporated when the Compass moved south the 1,200 at CMA Ingersoll, who lost shift capacity, and the thousands across Windsor's parts sector whose order books contracted. Lana Payne's description of workers being liberated from their good union jobs was not hyperbole. It was a headcount. Some have driven the 401 to join the Stellantis Windsor assembly plant's third shift, added because the Dodge Charger platform built there is too integrated with Windsor's specific capabilities to be easily relocated. It is a real bright spot. It is also one plant, one platform, in a sector that covers a province. RBC Economics published a scenario analysis in May 2026, modeling the Canadian automotive sector to 2040. The optimistic scenario, CUSMA, renewed with automotive provisions intact projects Canadian assembly volume reaching 2 million units. The pessimistic scenario, CUSMA, automotive provisions weakened or stripped projects assembly plants, leaving Canada, and the country's automotive manufacturing presence effectively eliminated by 2040. Those are not activist numbers. They are a major bank's modeling of policy outcomes. And the July 1st CUSMA review determines which set of conditions applies. There is another angle that almost nobody in Windsor is talking about publicly, though privately it dominates every boardroom conversation in the sector. The Windsor Corridor's decline is being absorbed by American factories in ways that are not sustainable and that creates a real negotiating card for Canada, if it is used correctly. Specialized automotive tooling and components cannot be replaced quickly. A tool and die shop that has spent 3 years developing process knowledge for a specific suspension geometry is not interchangeable with a domestic American shop that has never run that tolerance profile. When Windsor suppliers reduce output because their order books collapsed, the American Tier 1 assemblers that depended on those components face sourcing gaps that take 12 to 18 months to fill domestically, at higher cost and with higher rejection rates during the qualification period. That cost is showing up in American assembly plant budgets right now. It is one of the reasons 69 U.S. business associations wrote to Trade Representative Greer in March 2026, urging a 16-year CUSMA extension not out of sympathy for Canada, but because their own production economics depend on the integrated supply chain. Carney's government has been explicit about not weaponizing this dynamic. When Greer warned Canada against using energy or critical minerals as bargaining tools, Carney's response was deliberate. Canada would not threaten. But holding a position is different from threatening. Canada's automotive sector, its critical minerals, and the economic feedback loop that its supply chain disruption creates in American factories, none of these require Canada to make an explicit threat. They are simply present. And they are part of what makes the CUSMA review consequential for both sides, not just for the one that has lost more jobs in the past year. The Nexstar Energy plant in Windsor, a $5 billion EV battery facility originally intended to supply Stellantis, is the clearest example of Canada's pivot strategy in practice. When EV demand shifted, Nexstar adapted its production toward grid energy storage systems rather than vehicle batteries. That pivot required technical reconfiguration and investment. It also demonstrated that Windsor's workforce and its industrial base have capabilities that extend beyond their original mandate. Kingston's argument that Canada must preserve its automotive assembly footprint or lose the ability to anchor future automotive activity is correct. But the Nexstar example suggests that the footprint's value is not purely in what it produces today. It is in the industrial capacity and skilled trades knowledge that can be redirected when the market shifts. Now, here is where this starts affecting people who are not following the trade file from a spreadsheet. If you work in Windsor's tool and die sector in one of the facilities along EC Row Expressway, or in the smaller shops in Tecumseh and LaSalle that feed into the larger supply chain, the past 18 months have been a combination of compressed margins, canceled orders, and the specific anxiety of watching a customer base that took decades to build make production decisions based on a tariff environment that changed in a single executive order. If you work at the Stellantis Windsor assembly plant, you are in a better position than most. The third shift edition is real, and the charger platform's Windsor integration makes relocation difficult in the short term. But you are also watching the sector around your plant contract. The tool and die shops that supply your facility's maintenance and tooling needs are the same shops watching their Tier 2 order books compress. The health of Windsor Assembly is connected to the health of the broader parts sector in ways that do not show up in a single plant's employment numbers. If you live in Brampton and lost production certainty when the Compass moved to Belvidere, the notice of default is real legal action but a slow one. The dispute will take months or years to resolve. In the meantime, the production is in Illinois. Carney's government has committed to fighting the CUSMA review to preserve automotive provisions. Whether that translates into production decisions that stay in Canada depends on what is agreed before July 1st. The CUSMA review is not an abstract diplomatic event for Windsor, Brampton, Ingersoll, or Oshawa. It is the legal framework that determines whether the integrated supply chain that built those communities has a future inside Canada's borders, or whether the next production decision follows the same path that the Jeep Compass did. So here's the question. Windsor has been absorbing a compound shock tariffs and EV cancellations simultaneously that no single policy response could have fully cushioned. The Stellantis Brampton decision demonstrated that the rules of the game have changed. Production follows the tariff environment, and Canada is not currently the lower tariff environment. RBC has modeled a scenario in which the sector does not survive a weakened CUSMA framework. Carney is fighting the July 1st review from a position of constitutional mandate and genuine economic leverage. But the workers who have already lost production certainty are not waiting in the abstract. They are driving to Windsor, or they are waiting for a legal dispute to resolve, or they are their tool and die shop run at half capacity while the next order decision gets made in a boardroom in Detroit or Auburn Hills. Is Carney's approach the right one? Some will argue that holding firm on the CUSMA automotive provisions, refusing to trade them for short-term relief, is the correct long-term strategy, and that July 1st gives Canada the leverage to make that case. Others will argue that 3,000 Brampton workers and a Windsor parts sector running at compressed margins are paying a daily price for a strategy that has not yet produced a single auto tariff reduction. Both arguments are honest. Drop your answer in the comments. And if you want to understand what this same disruption looks like from the American factory floor, that story is on our partner channel, North Decoded.